Hello and welcome to Wizards, Warriors and Words, a fantasy writing advice podcast. I'm Jed Herne, author of The Thunder Heist.
I'm Dirk Ashton, author of Beyond Redemption.
I'm also Dirk Ashton, author of The House of Sacrifice.
I guess I'll also be Dirk Ashton today. I've never written anything, though. I don't know why I'm here.
And we are joined by someone who will hopefully be who they actually are for the introductions, Adrian Tchaikovsky. Adrian, do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, I am not Dirk Ashton. I am Adrian Tchaikovsky, fantasy and sci-fi writer, best known for Children of Time, which is giant spiders doing very well in space, thank you. Most recent book, Doors of Eden, which is sort of parallel world evolutionary thriller, let's say.
Awesome.
Something like that.
And I'm sure we'll be touching upon...
I need a better elevator.
You did a good one last episode. That was. I'm sure we were talking about Doors of Eden a lot more because
that was at least an hour ago. I can't remember anything about
it. It was actually a week ago, minimum, when listeners heard it, due to the magic of editing. But today's episode will be all about world building. And again, I feel like we're blessed with the perfect guest in Adrian because your sci-fi worlds really do explore some extensive and unique territory, I think. So to kick off this discussion about world building, I was wondering if you could maybe just describe to us what your approach looks like, Adrian, where you kind of get your initial inspiration for things from, and then how you develop and build things out so that they feel realistic and immersive and, above all, entertaining.
Okay, I mean, the big thing I do with fantasy and with sci-fi is I usually take a fantastical element and then effectively normalize it. So I don't tend to write fantasy settings where there is magic but nobody knows about it, or it's an ancient hidden order, or there is a single, there are these hidden vampires or wizards kind of behind everything, or an ancient evil that nobody really believes in. I will take an element like people have powers derived from insects, or people can change into animals. And I'll say, fine, everyone does that. That is the normal. Everyone completely accepts that. What does that do? What does that change? And it's basically like dropping a stone in the middle of a pond and you see where the ripples go. And once you've kind of transformed your world through that lens, that gives you a very coherent, sort of solid base to write, base of a world to write stories in. And it also gives you you can then, when you're saying, because for me things like characters and plot come after that. I know that's not the majority opinion on from writers, but once I've got the world, I then say, well, all right, who are the interesting characters this world produces? Where are the novel flashpoints and areas of friction that this world produces, where the stories are going to come from? So everything arises out of that world. So with me, the world is basically everything. And at the same time, it's also the thing I'm particularly interested in writing about. I want to tell a story set in that world, but I also want to tell a story that explores it from the point of view of the people who live in it.
That's a great way of looking at it. And I love that point you said about how you kind of try to normalize the fantastic, because I definitely can see how it can be almost a little bit of a, not to say this is necessarily bad, because I've written these kind of stories, I love these kind of stories, but it can be a bit of a crutch when people say there's this fantastical element, but apart from that, the world is more or less the same because hardly anyone knows about it. And that's good because it lets you have sort of mystery as you discover this new thing, but at the same time, it means that you don't have to possibly think about how it impacts on society in a large way. So that's interesting that there's almost, what you've said there is there's kind of like two different schools of thought with this. It's you make the fantastic secretive, or you make the fantastic sort of normalized. How much world building would you say stays in for your books? Do you cut a lot of stuff?
I mean, you have to really. I think it's one of the art of writing a fantasy novel is really the art of leaving stuff out. Because and the temptation is always, certainly for me, is always to put as much of it in as possible and to bury the narrative into these immense mountains of discussion about the world. And so it becomes an exercise in the framing shot and the backdrop and the odd sort of chance mention that lets you build the world on a grand scale and make it this sort of immersive, real place that you feel real people live in. Whilst at the same time letting the narrative breathe and letting the characters breathe and not just putting them permanently in the shadow of your kind of enormous exposition mountain hovering over them at all times.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, I think it's definitely, yeah, you're right. It is so much of a subtractive art as it is an additive art when it comes to developing these sort of things.
Yeah, that's part of why
Yeah,
I
Mike.
find world building so frustrating. Is because when I get into it, I'll end up with like a 30 to 60,000 word document of like background and like magic system stuff. And then when I write the book, almost none of that actually gets to make it in there because it's just not actually important to the story. And now I think, one of the responses I get is like, oh yeah, it feels like there's so much more going on. And it's like, there is, there really is.
I genuinely, I think that's an essential component when you're building a world. If you want to make it an immersive world, you need to build a world where the reader certainly comes away with the idea that there is a ton of stuff extending off the edge of the map, off the edge of the page, because that's how worlds work. I mean, you do get some narratives, or certainly it's a fancy narrative you used to see where basically by the end of the trilogy, everywhere on the map has been explored and no one has ever mentioned anywhere that isn't on the map. And so you get the impression that this world is almost, it's like a little perfectly self-contained biosphere that exists purely to tell that one story. And that's fine. That's the way you can do it. But I as a reader, I always feel with a book like that, you come to the end and feel that wasn't a world I'm immersed in. That wasn't a world I feel I can go back to. That wasn't a world I have any questions about. And therefore the book just slides out of the mind. Whereas with a book where the world has that kind of implied expanse to it, whether or not that, I mean, which you can absolutely do without the 60,000 word document, in all honesty, if you very carefully tailor. And I mean, I'm very much like you. I do all that. I do a lot of work ahead of time to work out how it all fits together. But even a few just sort of chance remarks about events or places or creatures that don't turn up in the book can give such a flavor of the wider world without necessarily needing to have anything behind them. It's again, it's all part of the art.
I think Rob did that
kind of
really well.
You want to feel the world is living, so that you want to feel that as a reader, after the story ends, the world keeps on going. It doesn't just stop. You want to feel like the characters are still around there doing their things, having new adventures and all of that lot.
From a purely commercial perspective, of course, it means you can write sequels.
Yes. I wanted to touch upon that later, actually. But with that idea, I love that term you brought up, Adrian, of implied expanse, because I think like reading the War Eternal trilogy that Rob wrote, like you did that so much, where you sort of just like give a term for a thing. You're like, there's this desert where this eye looks out through a rift through reality or whatever. And
I did that all the time. I mean, I didn't have a document to work from. I was making shit up as I went along with the War Eternal. But yeah, that was kind of a large part of the entire idea behind it. I was just like, I'd throw an idea out there, like a concept. Yeah, like this tear in the universe where an eye's staring down upon the world in some sort of eldritch horror type thing. And I always thought like, hey, maybe I'll actually go there and do something with it. Maybe not.
You have to read to find out. Yeah,
but like Adrian said, it also gives me the chance to write a sequel where they go and explore this type thing.
Absolutely. And I think it's just that specificity of, giving as much detail as you possibly can so that readers are fooled into thinking that you've thought it out really well. Because if you just sort of say like the land to the east, readers are going to be thinking, okay, well, he doesn't actually know what's going on there. But if you're like and you give a very specific name for it, and then you maybe like throw in a couple of little flavoring details about this land
the main
to the
export
east.
is nuts and fruit.
Exactly. Done. Instantly. Readers are thinking, geez, this author really knows their stuff about medieval trading routes and different nut exports.
But in reality, you've just got a bowl of nuts and fruit next to you, and you're like, wow, what do they do? What do they do? Nuts and fruit.
100%. Are you a maps guy, Adrian? Do you draw them to help you in the worlds that you build?
For some books I have. I mean, certainly the Shadows of the Apt had a map. I mean, it had a map. Came pre-mapped because it was a role-playing game I ran before it was a series of books. But I think when you are doing that big old epic fantasy, the map becomes an invaluable tool purely for you as a writer, so that you can work out where everything is, and getting people from place to place is a colossal part of large-scale fantasy books. Yeah, obviously going back to Tolkien and beyond. I mean, Lord of the Rings is basically an entire exercise in getting people from A to B that have a lot of complications in the middle.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, a map is, as it has a practical use for the writer, and then it, in a very large and complicated book, a series where the reader may be going 1 to 2 years between books, the map is useful because it means the reader can have instantly look at the map. Oh yeah, that's there, that's what's going on. That's the relationship between these two countries or locations or whatever, and it's genuinely useful. I mean, I think there's a lot of shade on maps in books, and that seems to come from the idea that, oh well, you have a map in the book, you're kind of pinning the world down, and then you visit all the bits on the map, and exactly because people who seem to assume it automatically leads to the kind of book I was talking about a moment ago, which, whilst I think that kind of book almost always does have a map, the map does not necessarily create that kind of book. So yeah, I mean, I'm pro maps where for that kind of book. I mean, I've never done maps for a sci-fi book or anything like that. But certainly my big fantasy stuff is always mapped out purely for the convenience of the reader and for my own reference.
Okay. I think you definitely struggle to have a map for sort of like Children of Time, seeing as how it takes place across many generations. It would be have to be an evolving map as you went on.
It could. I mean,
pretty cool.
I mean, honestly, you say that I could have done the book with an evolving map. I could have started each spider section with a map of the world as it expanded, as the spiders kind of explored.
As their web expanded, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it would have been necessary in the way that a map is useful for epic fantasy, but it would actually have been quite interesting, I think, to do. I suspect, but I mean, honestly, I suspect there's probably not quite enough geography in that book to make the maps interesting enough. But it would be a way of approaching that kind of narrative.
I would love to see some drawings of like the spider cities. I think that would be cool to have like as an illustrated thing for it.
Material there.
Yeah, we're going to continue with this in a second. Oh, sorry, Adrian.
My biggest ever trolling move as a writer to my readership was in the Shadows of the Apt, and it involved the map at the beginning of the Sea-Watch. So there's an area sort of south off the map in the earlier books called the Spiderlands, where the kind of the Spider Kindred people live, and you meet a lot of them, and you hear a lot about it. You never get to see it, and then the plot in the Sea-Watch seems to be working up to, well, this is obviously all going to come down to some sort of Spiderlands thing. And in the beginning of the book, there is the complete map of the Spiderlands. And then the book never goes there. The map is essentially part of the early book's misdirection of what's going on in the book.
That's clever. Yeah, you're totally right. That is a big giveaway when when maps only have information on cities that are on the western side of the country, for instance. You're like, well, we're probably not going over to the East Coast. So, yes. We're going to continue with this in a second, but we're just going to pause for our featured book of the week, which, Adrian, you have that again, if you would like to select the book to spruik to our rabid reader audience.
Oh, I should have prepped for this, shouldn't I? Hold on.
Yeah, I really need to give people more advance notice when we do the featured books rather than...
That's why I just tend to pick one off my bookshelf and go,
I mean, that works too.
Yeah.
So this is Firewalkers. This is a novella, not a full-on novel, so it's that thick.
Ooh,
this is my big kind of, I guess, climate change novella. It's set in the future in equatorial Africa, Gabon, I believe, to be specific, when the world is on the way out because of climate change. So some places are underwater and other places like this one are desertified. But even though the equator is no longer habitable, you need it for your space elevator because all the rich people on Earth are getting off to their big luxury spaceships up there. So Firewalkers is set in the township at the foot of the space elevator. All the people who maintain and previously built it, and the Firewalkers themselves are three kids who get to go out into the utterly lethal deserts to repair the solar farms because the rich people need their air conditioning before they go off on the spaceship. And it's about what they found out in the desert and what's been kind of growing and developing there.
That sounds
in all sorts of
awesome.
nasty ways.
That is Firewalkers by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I didn't actually know that was one of the books you've written. That's awesome. How does a world building for a novella do you approach that differently to a big fat, full length science fiction or fantasy book?
So novellas, especially for science fiction, I find the novella length, which for anyone who's not up, is usually about 30 to 40,000 words, is the absolute perfect length to fully explore a single idea. So it tends to be much more focused than a novel, but at the same time, unlike, say, a short story, you've got time to actually explore the world. And usually the idea I'm trying to explore is the world that I'm writing about. So, I mean, for my other novel, so The Expert Systems Champion is all about the world that that character finds himself in. And his journey is specifically taking the readership through, well, how did this world arise and what actually is going on? Because it's what appears to be going on at the beginning is not actually how the world is composed. And Firewalkers is certainly the explorational world, and Made Things, which is another one of my Tor.com novellas, is about the world of the little kind of marionette people that are invading human cities, which is so yeah, it's I think if exploring the world is what you're specifically wanting to do, it's a perfect length for it. If you wanted to tell a story but also take time to explore the world, that would probably push the boundaries of what you could fit into a novella length.
I totally agree with that. I think the first book that I published, Fires of the Dead, is basically, as you said, it's a 20,000 word novella that I pretty much wrote to explore a specific type of sort of fire-based magic system. And as you say, it's like just that's perfect sweet spot for kind of going deep into a specific idea or a concept that you're interested in, without necessarily having to get massively bogged down in side plots or things that detract from that. You mentioned role-playing before, and it's my understanding that you kind of have used role-playing in a very interesting way to sort of brainstorm and develop stories. Would you like to talk to that for a bit?
I mean, not so much, to be honest. Not in that. I mean, specifically the link with the role playing there is that the first series I wrote, Shadows of the Apt, is based on a role playing campaign I ran back at university, sort of 10, 15 years previous. And the advantage that brought to me was that it was a world I knew extremely well, because when you're running a role playing campaign, unlike when you're writing a book, the principal characters don't do what they're told and will wander off and go places that you didn't plan, and therefore you have to have a very good working knowledge of how the world works and what is in any given place people might want to go to, because you're kind of being dragged along after your willful band of players, which is perfect training for then writing books in the world, because wherever you want the story to go, you kind of know what's there already. And you can kind of just comfortably tell the stories that those places would naturally give rise to.
That was, I think, my favorite part about writing the first Obsidian Path book, which is based on a role-playing game like system I built and ran like a decade or two ago, was all the world building was done for me. It was like, you could basically launch straight into the story because I knew the world intimately, because I'd written the whole thing. I had books and books of information, and right there, 5 different magic systems laid out, rules for everything, how everything worked. I mean, if I wanted to get really retentive, I could dig in and be like, all right, how much is this spell going to cost? Kind of, level stuff.
That real nitty-gritty.
Because that's not actually interesting, but like having all that there at your fingertips was really nice. After like the amount of world building that I had to do for like, say, Manifest Illusions or City of Sacrifice stuff, the Obsidian Path book was just like straight into it. It's very cool.
But having that stuff is really useful. I mean, it's one of the tips we've actually mentioned on a previous episode, is when you've got that stuff just sat there, not necessarily going into the story, just sat there. It can seep in through the writing, you know, without you even sort of meaning to do it. Sometimes, you know, some of that information just seeps through, and it just makes the world building feel a lot more sort of, you know, complete and deep.
Hmm. Dirk, do you have anything to add?
One question one thing that I've thought about quite a bit regarding fantasy and sci-fi today, maybe fantasy more than sci-fi, is do you guys think that the resurgence, and the popularity, and having gone back so many decades now, of role-playing games, and the fact that I seem to be one of the very few authors who doesn't have a background in role-playing games. I've played, like, I think one half campaign of Dungeons and Dragons in college back in like the 1930s. But
You're not that old, Dirk.
how pervasive do you think the influence is now on role-playing games, and the fact that a lot of authors run role-playing games or have quite a bit? How much of that do you think affects fantasy today, and do you think it's that it's very different now and probably always will be because of that influence?
Yeah, I mean, for my money, I think you can't really overstate the impact it's had. The vast majority of fantasy authors of my generation are gamers. A fair number older than me are gamers. I mean, up to including George R. R. Martin, for example. And one of the things I think the influence of role-playing has done, it's broken down the sort of early post-Tolkienian sort of black-white morality narrative of there are these good people and here's the Dark Lord, and the heroes are heroic. They may have moments of doubt and they may have moments of worry, but they're basically heroic, and the villains are villainous, and there's a great big moral distance between them. The current wave of fantasy, you know, obviously, you know, up to and including obviously grimdark, which really epitomizes it, is very much more that morally grey area of more morally complex characters doing complex, frequently non-heroic things. And if you think of the way the average adventuring party behaves, that's kind of where that comes from, because players generally will frequently do very, very bad things. And so I suspect that the point that fantasy changed was the point where you are giving kind of random groups of players command of the destiny of, in inverted commas, heroes, and finding out that actually they don't tend to be that heroic a lot of the time.
That's a fascinating observation.
I would love to know, does anybody know if Stephen R. Donaldson was a player? Let's talk about, I mean, he seriously goes into that morally ambiguous.
Do you think he does? I mean, and if we're looking at the Thomas Covenant stuff, I think the Thomas Covenant moral lines are drawn as hard as they are in Tolkien, and the crossing of them by Covenant is extremely, almost sort of symbolically performative. And it happened, and then after that, it doesn't really happen again. And it's just there's that incident he carries around with him. But I don't think, as a series of books, I don't think it has any of that grayness. It has very explicit, literal in-world divisions of good and evil.
Yeah.
So I don't know. He would have to have been quite early on the scene for gaming, I think, given the time he was writing. But I don't think if he was playing, it doesn't, to my mind, show in his writing in the same way that it does in later authors.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean,
Any
there
other
is
things
there's
before we
the
close
thing
on?
where he slaps his daughter when she comes on to him, but that's a little bit later and very strange.
I do have one question I was thinking about. How do you find world building differing for you between the science fiction and the fantasy stuff?
Great question.
Like science fiction seems like I've got one SF novel, and frankly, the amount of research I had to do just to do that one book was insane. Whereas with the fantasy stuff, I can just kind of whole cloth make shit up. How's that for you?
I mean, science fiction is another continuum. It very much depends where you're aiming with your science. So Children of Time, although it does get described as a space opera, is to me much more of it's a hard science fiction book where I am trying to get the science as right as possible, because if nothing else, I think the impact of the spider civilization would be considerably lessened if I wasn't trying to make it plausible. You know, if it was very hand wavy and they're basically magic talking spiders, it's not the same thing as the idea that actually this is the thing that conceivably could evolve, even if it's got a kind of the nanovirus kind of driving it along at a bit of an accelerated rate. And so there, yes, the science, I worked very hard to get the science right, and it is, you know, it is a whole extra burden of work in the setup of the book. And I spoke to physicists, and I went to the Natural History Museum in London and sat in with the entomology department and quizzed them about the sort of the structural challenges of when you make your invertebrates bigger and things like that. And I've done the same with, Doors of Eden has a fair amount of that on the evolutionary side. The physics of water-filled spacecraft were a whole thing for Children of Ruin, because that gives you some very interesting kind of just engineering challenges. The chap called Nick Bradbeer, who is my go-to for spaceship design. And we spent a long time going back and forth on precisely what you would need and the challenges involved. Whereas, for example, I'm currently working on a series called The Final Architecture, the first of which is out sort of mid next year, called Shards of Earth. And that is much more explicitly a space opera. So although it has rules in the way its sort of technology works, they are a bit more divorced from real science and far more kind of speculative. And in that way, it's a bit like developing a fantasy world, in that the point there is you need to develop something that is consistent, but you're not actually bound to the way the real world works if you don't want to.
Yeah, I remember the ant computers.
So cool!
Love that part.
Amazing.
Love that. That just, that was one I think I had to go through and reread it again because I was like, work. That was really cool.
Awesome. Well, I think this is. Does Rob have a creature on his lap? I didn't even notice Cora coming.
Yeah, I've got a little monster here.
For people who are listening, Rob has got his beagle on his lap right now, which is very
She should have
appropriate.
turned up for the last one when we were specifically talking about animals.
Yeah.
And everything. She turned up for this one instead.
Well,
Awesome.
At least one recording session, once every recording session.
Yes.
I did have a crack at dogs in Dogs of War.
Dogs of War, yes.
Which I think is still my favorite of my own sci-fi books.
Is it? I saw that in my local library the other day. I have to give it a read.
That's got a sequel coming out in January.
Oh, nice. Is there anything quickly that you did in the world building of Dogs of War that made it your favorite science fiction book out of the ones you've written compared to other ones?
I think it's when we're talking about the idea of using animals to explore human nature, that's where I go deepest into that. Because for any who don't know the book, it's near future. We have bioengineered animal soldiers kind of taking part in wars around the world, mostly ostensibly because they can do dangerous things that won't get humans killed, but also because they can do terrible things that won't get humans blamed. And it's about a squad of these led by a dog called Rex, which gets cut off from its chain of command and has to start making its own kind of ethical decisions about what is and isn't right to do. And then it kind of spirals. It's about the rights of non-human sentience. It's about morality and ethics in general, how society approaches change, because obviously as the book goes on, you have things like the UN World Court and so forth having to decide, well, do these things have rights, or are we allowed to just effectively dispose of them all after the war's finished? And I think it's one of my shorter books, weirdly enough, and it's 50% told through the point of view of Rex, who starts off with a very simple worldview, which is basically, I want to be a good dog, I will do what master tells me, and then has to effectively construct himself an outlook based on what he's seeing and what he's being advised by the other characters, until he becomes a very complex character towards the end, and a very wise character. And I think that the development of Rex as the spokesperson for the book and as the point of view character was something I feel I managed to nail very nicely.
Awesome. Okay.
Just me, or does every time Adrian like mentions one of his books and describes what it's about, you're like, oh, damn, I want to read that.
Yep.
That's the idea.
You're too good at describing these things, Adrian. It's almost like you've written books that are really amazing and that they just sell themselves through their own concepts. Who would have thought? Anyway, that is a good point to wrap this one up. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We will see you again next time. Bye, everybody. And thanks again for coming, Adrian.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Wizards, Warriors, and Words. If you enjoyed this, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so that we can keep growing this and keep sharing our writing advice with more authors. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.